Have you ever been to a banh mi place and seen these pastries sitting in the pastry warmer display case? Those are most likely pate saute, a meat-filled savory pastry that is perfect for breakfast, a quick snack, or an appetizer. When I find myself craving a pastry, more often than not, it's a savory one. Pate saute is the perfect pastry to satisfy my savory craving, because not only is it savory, it's also funky, fragrant, and juicy. Let's start with the filling. It's made with ground pork. You can also use ground chicken if you're looking for a healthier option. I'm not sure about ground turkey though, since it's so lean. But if any of you have ever tried using ground turkey, please let me know how it is, because I'm always looking to recreate classic recipes with alternative ingredients. Oh, and ground beef too. Do you think that will work? Going back to the filling, the next ingredient is pate, which is a pork liver spread. I'm using liverwurst, which is what was available at my local grocery store, so if you can't find pate, this is a good alternative. I'm a huge fan of funky flavors, so I ended up using the entire can of this, but if you don't like the liver flavor, feel free to dial it back, leave it out, or even use a milder tasting pate, like one made with chicken liver. I'm using dried wood ear mushroom, which I rehydrated in hot water for 15 to 20 minutes. I slice these up really thin, making sure to cut out any tough parts because that won't be nice to chew in your pastry. If you have access to fresh wood ear mushrooms, which is usually available in the fresh produce section of most Asian grocery stores, those work too, and you can skip the rehydrating step. I didn't get this on camera, but you'll need to saute the wood ear with diced yellow onion on the stovetop until they are fragrant and just starting to caramelize. This took about 8 minutes for me as I was cooking them on medium heat. To really boost the umami flavor in here, we are also adding chicken bouillon with salt and a tiny bit of sugar for balance. We're also putting a generous amount of black pepper in here because if you didn't know, Vietnam is the biggest exporter of black pepper, so if you want this to taste authentic, you gotta put lots of black pepper. Also, don't forget to taste your filling before moving on to the next step. And no, do not taste the raw meat filling. You have to take a little scoop of it and either microwave it or you can pan fry it to cook it all the way through before tasting it. And that way you can adjust the seasoning to your liking. Recently, I've been working on developing my own puff pastry recipe. I made a batch of puff pastry using this recipe. That's what you see here. Yes, that sheet of puff pastry is homemade by me. I thought a pastry with a heavy, meaty, and juicy filling would be the perfect way to test the integrity of this puff pastry. So that's my ulterior motive for making pate saute today. It wasn't just because me or my family was craving it. I am working on a video at the moment to share this puff pastry recipe so you can make it for yourself too. Check back in a couple weeks and you'll be able to find it on my channel. I did share the recipe in one of my YouTube shorts and on TikTok, but this long form video will be more of a detailed guide. I made this pastry a couple days earlier, wrapped it up, and stored it in the freezer. Then pulled it out and let it defrost at room temperature for 30 minutes to an hour before I rolled it out, just like you would with a store-bought puff pastry. I know what you might be thinking. Why on earth would I make my own puff pastry at home when I could just buy it from the store? And I 100% understand why you would think this because I thought it too, until I fell in love with laminated pastries. Eating them, making them, the whole lamination process just scratches my brain all over. If you don't know the term lamination, it's the process that's used to make pastries like croissants and puff pastry that involves layering butter in between dough to create a super flaky and shatteringly crisp bite. It is a tedious process because it's very precise and technical, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. If you're on this channel and watching these videos, you're probably a baker and you're probably a pastry lover. So these are my 3 reasons to make homemade puff pastry. One, most pre-made puff pastries you find at the store aren't even made with butter. They're made with oils like palm or soybean oil, which clearly impacts the taste of the pastry. Speaking of taste, that leads me to my next point. It's really nice to have a one-size-fits-all option, especially if you're short on time or don't have the capacity or interest to think about how to make something better. But I truly believe in putting maximum effort into the things you care about, and to me that looks like using different flours to make puff pastry to pair with a particular filling, or doing additional folds during the lamination to get that exact kind of crisp, crunch, or chew I'm looking for. So my reason number 2 for making my own puff pastry at home is to have the ability to customize and have total ownership of the thing I'm making. And reason number 3, I said it before and I'll say it again, lamination is such a beautiful process and I think it's just so much fun. The pate so I've seen at banh mi shops are usually round, so I wanted to mimic that but put my own twist on it. I used a 3-inch scalloped circle cutter. There's so much room for customization with this pastry. The round pastry does produce a good amount of trimmings, which I'm just going to smush together and save for my next pastry creation. But if you want to minimize the amount of trimmings you have, cutting them into squares or rectangles will do the trick. If you're making these for appetizers, for example, you can also shape them into a sausage roll shape, which you can then cut into bite-sized pieces. Perfect for finger food. I'm inspired by the hot water crust pastries I've been seeing all over Pinterest, and most of them have a hole at the top to allow steam to escape. So I wanted to incorporate that into the design of this pastry, but that can also be achieved by using a knife to cut a small hole at the top. I'm just using a small piping tip to cut out this hole. If I'm eating a pastry, I want it to be packed with filling. And if I'm making a pastry for someone, I never want them to be disappointed by the amount of filling they find inside. That being said, it is a careful balance of putting enough filling for the perfect, satisfying bite and putting too much filling that it overwhelms the pastry. I found that for the amount of pastry I have here, this scoop was the perfect amount of filling, which is about 1.5 tablespoons. I might be able to get away with just 1 tablespoon of filling since this pastry was so light that the rich meat filling really came through just fine. But as long as you can easily seal the pastry without the filling squishing out, it's a good sign that you don't have too much filling. To get the pastry to seal, I egg wash the bottom pastry before adding the filling, then put the second piece of pastry on top of the filling, and lightly push down on the edges to seal it. You can use a fork to push down on the edges to create a crimped look, but I wanted to avoid crushing the pastry too much so that it can puff up to its full potential. This part is definitely a test of patience, because at first it doesn't seem like the pastry is large enough to fully encase the filling, but if you slowly and carefully work the pastry around the filling, it will seal, I promise. I was feeling super creative that day and thought, why not score a design on the top pastry? I've seen pastries like the galette de roi or the French king cake, and I just love how the final pastry looks with the scored pattern. I didn't have much real estate to work with, so I thought a simple design would be perfect. I used a slightly smaller round cutter to create a border. The pastry was getting pretty soft from being at room temperature for so long, so I stuck them in the freezer for 30 minutes to let them harden up, which makes scoring a whole lot easier. After egg washing, I used a sharp paring knife to score a line starting from the edge of the center hole, curving down to the scalloped edge. I spaced the lines around 1/4 inch apart and went all around until I met my first line. I used my cake turntable to help guide the curve of my knife, but honestly, this design was more of an afterthought. I didn't think to do this until after all the pastries were already placed on the sheet pan, so they were fairly close to each other and the edges of the sheet pan kind of got in the way. I think they still look super cute and whimsical though, so I don't regret it. They're gonna bake at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 to 25 minutes or until the pastry is a dark golden brown and the meat filling temperature is reading at least 165 degrees Fahrenheit. That steam hole at the top really came in handy because I was able to stick my thermometer probe in there without having to poke a hole in the pastry. Look how tall this puff pastry got. I'm so happy with that because that means I did the lamination correctly and it's going to be super light and flaky and crisp. My designs kind of got lost since the pastry shrank as it baked, but I think it looks really amazing and more interesting with a little pattern on them. These tasted so good. They were so delicious, and honestly so much better than any pate saute I've had from the banh mi shops. It was juicy, seasoned perfectly, and the funk of the pate really came through. And the thing that made this perfect was my homemade puff pastry. It was so light and flaky. There's sourdough, whole wheat, and rye flour in this pastry, which really balanced the fatty richness of the meat filling. But also the wonderful buttery flavor coming through made such a heavenly bite.